Hello, and welcome to Enlightened Empaths, your community for the spiritually awakened. This week, Denise and I are going to be discussing IQ versus EQ. And we're going to discuss what makes an empath so special, what does an EQ quotient mean for the empath, and how can you balance this to really be the best empath you can be. Does that sound like a good summary, Denise?
That's a perfect way to put it. Yes, that's a nice start.
So IQ is something I think we've all heard of and we've all aspired to. It was created, or the test to test IQ was created in the late 1800s. It's a standardized test that supposedly tells you how smart you are, but it really only gives you your prediction of how successful you'll be in academics, in strategizing, in logical reasoning, in quantifying and qualifying information. EQ came along much later in the late 1980s. So about 100 years later, we have this idea of an EQ, which is your emotional capacity to understand people and feelings, emotions, compassion. There is a test to determine your EQ level, but it's very subjective, and a lot of researchers don't like the idea of an EQ test because if you know you're taking a test that is going to, qualify your emotional quotient, they believe that you'll answer the questions in a different way. So it's a very subjective test, but there is a test. You can Google it if there is one online, and it'll give you a result of how emotionally smart you are.
That's perfect because the EQ quotient, the research really is promoting that as far as intelligence as a whole, or ability to function on the planet, or being able to navigate situations and be successful, 20% of that is equated to actual IQ or intelligence quotient, whereas 80% is related to your emotional quotients, how you read situations, being more creative, using your emotions to solve problems. So technically, from what I read and research, there are certain things about EQ as far as a greater impact on your success because there might be an ability to delay gratification, or the importance of building healthy relationships with other people in a work environment, or in general in your community. Those skills can't be measured on a traditional intelligence quotient test, but are more vitally important to your emotional and health and success levels.
When I was doing research for this show, I came across a website that talked about the pros and cons of having an IQ versus a high IQ versus a high EQ. And one of the interesting things that they can't necessarily connect is that people with a high IQ tend to have much better health and live longer. I wonder if it's because they have higher reasoning capabilities, and so they won't be subjected to that cognitive dissonance. So they'll understand, eating more fruits and vegetables is healthy for me. I don't know.
Right.
They do tend to make a lot more money, but people with a high EQ have longer lasting relationships and tend to report more general happiness in their work and in their interfamily relationships, which I think is sometimes more important than just living longer or having money.
You have to wonder if IQ is generally and historically more celebrated in a traditional educational setting.
Yes.
Students tend to be more successful. They tend to be able to navigate the educational system easier than someone who may not have that higher. And I'm basing this on my experience as a special ed teacher for so many years. And I did have to administer IQ tests. I had to sit in thousands of meetings, literally, because I did it for a long time. And, there are traditional IQ tests that measure verbal and performance, the Wechsler, the Stanford-Binet, the Woodcock-Johnson test of cognitive ability, and they give you a number. And when I did do academic testing or cognitive testing when I was employed in that field, I would always do an informal assessment to counter, to either support or counter what came up in the standardized test, because there are so many variables to consider, but so often it's seen as definitive. It's seen as, okay, so-and-so's IQ is this, they're never able to rise above that level. Not, I'm thinking it when one of my sons, we lived in the Deep South when he was a little tiny guy, and they wanted to test him for the gifted program. And they had a student come in from Florida State, and she was from, I don't know if she was from Ghana or she was from another country, had a very thick accent. So would that have changed the results of what he scored? I mean, he did really well, but there was a little African-American boy in my class, and the cultural and the like, just as an example, one of the questions was about, they show you a picture and is it a grasshopper? And he said, that's a hoppergrass. And she marked it wrong, but culturally that was what it was for him. So those little variables can really skew, and people can lock onto that score to the exclusion of what someone's true ability is. And that's just my own humble opinion. I have to add that in, but it's also from watching people be limited. I have to throw in one more quick example of, there was a young man that was in my program at a high school level. And one day I looked at him, I said, you don't belong in here, do you? And he said, well, what do you mean, Miss Carell? And I said, you're playing people, you're a smart guy. And he said, yeah, but this is so much easier. And he started to laugh. He had been identified as a little tiny guy into special services, early elementary. And because of, when I looked back, there were so many upheavals in this little guy's life, familial, environmental, all these things, but they locked him into the program and he never got out. So he hit high school, and now he's working at a really high level job at BIW, Bath Iron Works. So once he got out of the educational system, he allowed himself to be intelligent again in a way that, but spot on with, he could read people beautifully, his EQ was really high. He was really a nice kid, but people kept blinders on and kept, year after year, would look at those numbers and say, but he only functions here. So that's just my soapbox about, don't always take an IQ test as a definitive measure of what someone's ability is.
Right. Which is why it's so important to have advocates for your child's schooling, whether it's you or someone like you in the educational classroom, because those little differences in elementary school lead to bigger differences in middle school and high school, and then ultimately dictate, your future. Yes. So it's a big deal. I have a quick funny story to share about IQ. When I was in the second grade, I took the test to get in the gifted program. What do they call it now? AIG, IG?
It depends on where you are. There's all kinds of acronyms for.
When I was in elementary school, they just called it the gifted program, and I missed it by 2 points, which did not please my mother at all. So she had a meeting with the head of the program and shared with him some rumors circulating around town about some, let's just say, extra activities he was doing outside of school. And suddenly Samantha was in the gifted program.
It just flashed in my head, that old country western song, Harper Valley PTA. I don't know if you've ever heard it.
Oh, yeah, I've seen the movie. But yeah.
But obviously it's where you belonged as well.
I guess. I don't know. My mom sure thought I belonged there. And sometimes I think that's half the battle in life, is just someone saying, I believe in you. I think you're smart.
Yes.
And I think so many kids, because this number identifies them, so often they don't get that. Luckily, I don't want to make this show about education, but there are a lot of good things coming up. I love what Goldie Hawn is doing with her program to bring more values-based education into the broader curriculum. I think it's having wonderful effects. And so hopefully a lot of this will be changing. The whole concept of an EQ being valuable and a marker of success is so new. So I do think we're going to see a lot of positive changes coming. Now, people who have a high EQ do tend to be more empathic. And so that's why we thought this would make a really good topic for today's show. And there are so many positives that we can see about having a high EQ, which is just so subtle, picking up on social cues. Personally, Denise, I'm always amazed when people don't pick up on those cues.
Mm-hmm.
You know, with the little eye movement, if I'm talking to someone and they look over my shoulder or they look at their watch, I get it. They're bored. They want to move on.
Right.
If, you know, and if I remember as a teacher, students would talk to me after class, and this one student, it was my last class of the day, and all I wanted to do was get home to my babies. I had little babies. I was still nursing. I had office hours. All this kid wanted to do was just talk to me about nothing. If he came up to me and said, "Hey, Miss Faye, can you help me with this paper I'm trying to write for you?" I would have done it. But no, he'd come up and say, "Hey, did you see the game last night?" But just normal stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, I really have to run. Can you walk with me? I would give him so many cues that this was not a good time for me, and he never got them. I'm always amazed at people who don't pick up on those cues, and yet they're out there. There are more of them than us.
Right. But we're finding each other, and more people, I think, are becoming more emotionally aware and raising their, I think you can build your emotional quotient as well. I truly
I
do.
do
I
too.
don't think it's an innate, it doesn't mean you're locked in at that score for the rest of your life. You can develop higher levels of empathy and compassion. You can also, it's just exactly what you just said, when you recognize, when you become more in tune with your own feelings, your own emotions, that raises your EQ as well, because then you're able to identify those in other people. Does that make sense?
It does. I think a lot of empaths tend to protect themselves by living a lot of their time in their head. And so they tend to think about their emotions rather than feel their emotions as a way to protect themselves. And now we're seeing people getting older and stopping doing that. And they're starting to wake up. That's why I think we have so many listeners emailing us and Facebook messaging us saying, "I'm in my 40s or 50s and I'm just realizing I'm an empath." I think it's because of what you just said, that you can grow your EQ or grow into your EQ, I guess I should say.
Right. And some of the studies point to when your emotional quotient levels are lower, that's where you see the crime, you see unethical behavior, you see it can have an impact on your emotional and your physical health, which ties in with, it would be interesting to if you could ever figure out a way to measure, EQ and narcissism and the correlation between that and empaths, because I think there would be a strong link.
Yeah, I do too. I'm just glad. I feel like, if you take a broader look at this, we've gone from the age of enlightenment to the age of technology, or to the industrial age and then the age of technology. And I think the age of enlightenment did embody a lot of empathic EQ qualities. But I feel like the industrial age and the technology gone back to this more IQ thinking, rationalizing, and almost disparaging people that have emotions. And I feel like that pendulum is swinging back towards the middle now, which is really lovely. Because if people are encouraged to embrace their empathy, their compassion, and their emotions, and to see it as a strength and not a hindrance. I mean, really, if you look at, most of us grew up seeing our emotions as a hindrance. "Oh, you're so sensitive. Big girls don't cry." All those little subtle messages, and sometimes not so subtle messages we get to just buck up and move on and hide your emotions. I think we're moving away from that, which is a good thing.
Well, don't you think, too, that there's more, I hope this comes out, like a lot of times when I'm doing readings, it will come through that I'll visually see a brain and I'll see them, both sides light up. And I'll say to the person, "You're very blessed, both hemispheres light up," because that's the flash of a picture that I get in my head. And for me, that's a sign that someone is, very empathic, creative, intuitive, emotional, all of, the things that we talk about as empaths, but also grounded, linear, sequential, practical, analytical, able to function in a carbon-based world. And I think that part of this shift that we're in, or this awaken, whatever label we want to put on it, I really think this is going to sound a little over the top, but we're building more neural pathways and connections between IQ and EQ.
Mm. Yeah, I sure hope so, because sometimes I have to take long breaks from the news because it makes me feel like that isn't happening. You know, in the mornings when I'm getting the kids ready for school, I'll put the Today Show on, and they have this little thing called Hoda's Happy Moment.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like, it's some viral video that's going around of someone that's done something nice. And Denise, some of Hoda's happy moments are making Samantha sad.
Oh,
Like, it'll be a video of a young person holding the door for an old person.
that's
There was
just
a
normal.
video. That's just normal. There was a video that went around. This was such a big deal over the summer, and it's lovely. But this man came into, I think, a Waffle House in Texas, and I can't remember if he had just had a stroke, but he had some type of issue where his hand shook so much that he couldn't cut his food.
Mm-hmm.
So the waitress came over and cut his food for him. And another customer videoed this and put it online. It went viral. A school in Texas was so impressed with her kindness that they offered her a full college scholarship
Wow.
to their school, which is lovely. And I'm so happy that that young woman saw a man in need and helped. I do not mean to disparage the story
No,
at
she
all.
was just doing the right thing.
Right, but I just thought, where have we come in society where that is so unusual and special and spectacular that you become a national sensation for a while?
Right.
I just feel like we should live in a society where if someone can't hold the door, you hold it for them. If someone can't cut their food, you cut it for them. If someone's in
Right.
need, you help them. And it does trouble me. I'm glad we're pointing it out, but I find it odd that we need to point it out.
Right. And that it's foreign to a lot of people, but probably the people watching the video are us, the empaths. We're the
Right.
ones.
That's very, very true.
Another little thing that I had never heard of was AQ, which is, there's this man, Kevin Chin, and he has an entrepreneurial organization. And he says that the adversity quotient of having resilience in the business world is also something else to factor in with the whole discussion of IQ and EQ. That yes, you have your IQ that will give you those practical, grounded, and you have to have a certain level of functioning intelligence to be able to navigate the world without
Right.
assistance. That's not biased against anyone, high, low, in between. The emotional fluctuates. I think that also has a spectrum as much as the bell curve that goes with the traditional intelligence scale. But his point was that if you're a business person, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're looking to get ahead in that whole venue, you really need to have a resilience to keep going. And I thought that was a very good point, because it makes perfect sense. And that resilience might be getting through a difficult graduate program, or getting through an apprenticeship program, or getting through an entry-level job. But you have to have that push that's going to keep you're not going to give up and just fold.
I think that's key. When that book came out about the Korean prisoner of war, Unbroken, I think is the name.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I'm talking about? And then Angelina Jolie made a movie about him.
Yes.
I think it's called Unbroken. Anyway, when the book came out, I saw and listened to a bunch of interviews with a woman who researched survivors of atrocities like being a prisoner of war. And she came up with much the same findings that you're reporting. She said that there are 3 types of people in this world: the optimist, the pessimist, and the realist. And she said in traumatic situations, the optimist is the first to go.
Really?
Which kind of troubled me, because I'm kind of a natural optimist.
Me too.
Everything's going to be fine. Everything's going to get better. She said they're the first to go because they're so sure that everything's going to get better that when it doesn't, they tend to fall apart.
Huh.
And then the pessimist is the next to go, because they're pessimist and they tend to give up more easily because of that. It's the realist who survives.
Wow.
And I thought that was really interesting.
Was there a scenario given for this? Like,
Yes, but I can't recall them off the top of my head. She had researched a lot of people. I think she did like the remember the miners who were stuck underground
yes.
for like 49 in Chile? She had researched them and interviewed them and different circumstances like that all over. And what she came up with was that the optimist was the first to go, then the pessimist, and the realist was the survivor. I think she even used John McCain as an example. I could be misquoting her terribly, but that's how I recall it. But I remember thinking about that, and I don't look at these studies as necessarily 100% true or false, but I look at them as opportunities to learn. And I thought, and so since I heard that years ago, I've tried really hard to amend some of my natural habits, and I'm not trying to say I've tried to be less optimistic, but I have tried to be more realistic. And I do find it helpful, and I think it's a good survival tip for an empath. Because as empaths, for example, I always like to see the good in people. And isn't that lovely? Yeah, but it can bite me in the you-know-what, because sometimes I'll meet someone and intuitively I'll get a, ooh, stay away feeling. But cognitively, I'll think, oh, Samantha, they're probably just having a bad day. Be kind. And then it turns out that, ooh, from my intuition, was actually correct. And so now that I'm trying in the last several years to be more of a realist and just say, okay, they're probably not a nice person. It doesn't make them a bad person. They're just not for you. And I'm just more realistic about the people and situations that I encounter. I have found it much more helpful.
Right.
Like if I'm going through a difficult time, instead of wallowing in it and saying, oh, poor me, this is really hard, or instead of being optimistic about it and going, this is going to get better, tomorrow's another day, I'm more of a realist about it. And I go, this really sucks right now. What am I going to do about it?
Mm-hmm. And we were talking about that earlier, just that sometimes you have to say to yourself, time to buck up and get through this.
Yeah.
So back in the 90s, there was a best-selling book, Emotional Intelligence, Why It Can Matter More Than IQ, by Dan Goleman, Goleman. And he, talked about EQ, and I think that was kind of when this really started becoming more of a thing, more people recognizing that IQ wasn't the only measure of intelligence or success potential. And he said that people with high EQs tend to have 5 qualities or competencies in common. And it's funny because the number one thing he lists is optimism and the ability to anticipate best possible outcome. So I think as far as functioning on a daily level, not in a crisis situation, optimism really does help you take the high road, look for the best, realize it will get better. And then he said self-awareness, your knowledge of your current emotional state, your strengths, your weaknesses. And as empaths, I think that's so huge as we become. And don't you think that being an empath it gets stronger, it gets more of who we function as all the time?
I don't know if it gets stronger or if as you get older, you just come to accept yourself more. And at least for me, I always saw my sensitivity as a weakness.
Because people hurt us. People would go for the jugular and hurt you because you were sensitive. I'm saying that from myself. So you learn to put up the wall, put on the face, put up the mask, not say anything, hold back, all those lovely things we learn to navigate with so well.
Exactly. And I would always berate myself because every time the mean person would do something mean in my life, I was shocked as though it had never happened before. Every time. I mean, really, I had this awful boss. She was so evil, and she made my life living hell for the 18 months I had to work there. And every day I would think she had a really rough life, like really rough. And so I would think to myself, okay, Samantha, like she's had some shit happen in her past. Like, let's try this. And I would try like bringing breakfast to work one day, or another day I would try ignoring her and just nose to the grindstone and doing my job and not engaging her at all. Then I would try engaging her, and maybe she was a narcissist, and I would just focus on her and ask her questions, and nothing worked. She was always a machine gun with her attacks. And every day it was a shock. And instead of blaming her for just being an evil bee, I blamed myself for trying and having expectations and hope. So as I've gotten older, I've learned to just say, no, Samantha, that's what makes you a good person. That's not your weakness. That's your strength. So that's a long way to say, I don't know that it's necessarily that our empathy grows as it is so much that we grow into accepting our empathy.
Okay, so his second thing of self-awareness, accepting, being more aware of who we are and accepting it just as that's who I am. Okay. And interestingly, his third quality is empathy, understanding other people's point of view, decision-making processes. And in a work environment, in a social environment, even in just to be able to function, I think that's huge. That's everything we do is based on how we feel about things or how we process the emotions. Impulse control came up as the fourth, the ability to mitigate an urge to act, to think first and act later, which that I think that makes sense, because maybe it's because people with a higher EQ tend to hesitate a bit before jumping right in with the sensitivity.
Mm-hmm.
And the last one was reality testing, see things as they are, not as we want them to be. And a lot of times that's taking off the rose-colored glasses and exactly what you just said of expecting people to change or expecting a situation to turn out differently. And then all of a sudden you wake up one day and you say, oh my goodness, it's not going to change. The only thing I can change is me. So according to this man Goleman and the book that he wrote, the more the qualities that a person possesses and the more that they use them, the higher EQ they tend to have.
So the more that they trust themselves and trust their abilities and trust their emotions and give them the recognition and acknowledgement they need, the more that our EQ grows.
Yes.
Am I saying that right? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. I think it's important. My hope is that younger people in school start to recognize whether they are high EQ or IQ or both early on, because don't you think it really determines your career choice?
Oh, without a doubt. Without a doubt. And interestingly, this goes into what we talk about a lot of the younger generation, the people that are coming up in the world right now are wired differently, and they are, and I think personally, more balanced in many ways than a lot of us that are older, because they do have a higher EQ, maybe based on a kinder and gentler beginning, or I don't know. So
yeah, I read a study. An insurance company tested their sales employees based on the IQ test, and then they tracked them. And the sales agents who had a high EQ averaged insurance sales that were almost triple that of people that did not have a high EQ.
Makes perfect sense.
The authors of the study were like, isn't that amazing? And what can this tell us? And I was thinking, there's nothing amazing or shocking about that. Haven't you ever met a salesperson who just can't sell you anything because they can't relate to you, they can't emote with you, they can't make a connection to you?
They don't have the interpersonal skills,
right,
which is such a huge part of emotional intelligence.
Exactly. And if you want to sell me something, you're going to have to connect with me on a level that makes me want to give you whatever it is you're selling or give you the money for it. So I think that's so conversely, that's my IQ response. Conversely, I remember when my former husband and I, when we were dating, you know how you're so ridiculously in love, we couldn't be apart. So I would go on ride-alongs with him. You know, he was a police officer, so I'd get in the patrol car. He'd pick me up from school. I'd finished teaching at the community college, and he worked evening shifts, so we would miss each other too much. So I would teach all day, and then at 4 o'clock, he'd pick me up, and I'd go on these ride-alongs with him. And I remember this very first time I ever did this. He was like, you want to see where people get high around here? And I was like, sure, okay. It's such a new world to me. And he drives me through the government housing project area and down this back alley, and there's this old car just parked there, and he's like, oh, I got to call this in. And he comes out, and he takes the guy out, and this old man. He looked so nice and kind. I called him a little Morgan Freeman. He looked and sounded just like Morgan Freeman. Mm-hmm. And Mike puts him in the back of the car, and I'm sitting there in my little like Land's End twin sweater set with my little khaki pants, with my stack of essays on my lap and my pencil and grading papers. And he's speaking to me, and he's going, "Ma'am, you got to ask your partner not to arrest me." He's like, I quit for 12 years. I had a really bad week. I just got laid off, and I didn't mean to, but my wife will leave me. Denise, I was like trying to think in my head if I could get bail money for this guy. Like, right. It was terrible. I felt so bad for him. And Mike comes back in the car with the crack pipe in a bag, and another bag of crack in another bag, and he was like, "You broke the law." Like, he was, I don't want to hear it. Like, you broke the law. That was it. End of story. And I just remember thinking, I could never do this job. Never.
Right.
Can you imagine the people I would have let go? And I remember that night, when we were sitting in bed talking about how upset it made me, he just said, he pulled out his file, and he was like, "Do you want me to read you his track record?" And it was awful, like what that man had done in his life. It was a lot more than drugs. And I just thought, oh, there you go, Samantha. You can't, so I don't want anyone to listen to this saying that only people with high EQs are wonderful and kind and right. No. I think we need both in this world, and I just think it's important to find out where you fall in that spectrum and to ask yourself, does my work, does my life reflect these skills, not these weaknesses? Again, I really don't want anyone to see being sensitive or emotional as a weakness, as I did for so long. But then to look at, does my life reflect this strength that I have to really emote and connect with people? Because I think high EQ people should be in fields like ours, like counseling or social work, teaching, sales. I think there are specific careers that are really geared towards this. And I think there are many that are not geared towards this.
I agree. And I think as far as functioning in a workplace, there's an increasing demand for people to have the skills of negotiation, compromise, collaboration, and those can all be developed and increased. We come by them naturally. And I'm thinking about a lot of work situations where it may feel toxic, it may feel overwhelming. It would be interesting to see where EQ levels are with the people that you're dealing with, because it's just coming from a different perspective. But there are ways to build interpersonal skills. And, as we mentioned before, seeking self-awareness, because it can help you find your areas of improvement, ways to improve your work relationship through being patient, through empathy, through understanding. And when you're practicing those skills, you're developing the soft skills that will boost your performance and increase the quality of your work life. And I just thought about when you mentioned in another episode about doing the extra work at your job when you were faxing all the stuff, and you just kind of took that extra little bit to go a little bit further. But it was also boosting your performance so that you could increase your quality of your work life and have more opportunities. And this
so I could be promoted from the administrative assistant.
Yes. And now look at you now, girl. Trying to clear, I think another skill is trying to clear out that emotional interference. I think I had read one time that our brains process an emotional reaction before we can logically react to a provocation. It can take us like 20 minutes to recover from an emotional stimulus. And as empaths, I think it's even more. That's that playing that stuff over and over and over in our heads.
Like, is that just kind of threw me. I might need 20 minutes. No way. But seriously, do you mean like it takes 20 minutes to process a happy occasion just as much as it does a shocking or sad one?
I think I would say whatever would promote a more visceral reaction takes over the cerebral reason. So
Okay.
if it's stress or anxiety, how important it is to find a way to calm yourself down, to take a short walk, to meditate, to have a cup of tea, and then revisit the situation without letting the negative emotions influence your actions or your choices. So when we get bombarded with something that emotionally tips us upside down, I think more so than
Okay.
elevates our, you know,
That makes sense.
being objective. And this, uh, I think for a lot, I don't know if it's just me. I don't think it is. I think as empaths we do this. Someone will make an offhanded comment, and will take it so to heart,
Oh,
and may
yeah.
take it personally.
Yeah.
But they're saying that they're coming from their reality, not necessarily ours. So something that I've struggled with my entire life, and I still work on, and I'm doing better, but it's a steep learning curve, is not to take everything personally, and just sometimes accept other people's actions as a reflection of them instead of us. Like the blunt version would be, it's their crap, it's not our crap. But
That's
that's a
so
hard.
easy to say. Yeah, that's so hard to do. You know, I was talking to a friend about this the other day. She had a big church event at her home. And I guess a lot of her church people are really wealthy. I don't know, because she has a really nice, lovely home. And this woman was in her kitchen and she said, "My goodness, this is small. How do you cook in here?"
Oh my.
And I just was like, what was that lady thinking? Like, there's no way you could see that as a kind thing. Why even waste your time? You know, here my friend had opened up her home to her church members for an event they needed to house and host outside of church. And instead of saying, "Thank you, your home is lovely, thank you for your hospitality," she's asking her how she cooks in such a tiny kitchen. Hot stuff. Like, that didn't even happen to me, and I've carried it with me this week since she told me that.
And
It pisses me off, you know?
that's a really good point, because even if we hear someone else being the recipient of an offhanded comment, as empaths, we can take it to heart and own it too. So it doesn't even have to
Well,
be just directed at us.
I just think in every moment we have a choice. You know, we have a choice to be kind or to be rude. And the fact that so many people choose to be rude, and I know this is a very old woman. I know if I went up to her and said, "Hey, you really hurt my friend's feelings when you said blah, blah, blah," she probably had no clue. I don't think she did it maliciously or with any, you know, malice intent. I just think she genuinely doesn't think. I
Right.
think that's most of those people, but clearly has a low EQ, in my humble opinion.
Which kind of ties into being proactive versus reactive. So if something comes up and you're trying to figure out how to resolve the problem from a place of a higher emotional quotient, you know, being reactionary is going to undermine what you're trying to do. If you're trying to you know, self-manage or use your emotional intuition to resolve a situation, not reacting or not flaring or not, I'm kind of confused with the words I'm trying to get out on that, but I really
No,
think,
I know what you're saying.
okay, so trying to seek
It goes
solutions that
back to the
honor
four
both
agreements.
sides. Yes, yes,
Yeah.
very much so. And I think our empathy is our superpower in a work environment. So as much as we've talked about protecting ourselves, being bombarded, toxic work environments, you made an incredibly vital point earlier of being sensitive to those
Okay.
emotional signals, like tone of voice, body language, eye contact. That gives us um, such a base of knowledge and experience and expertise to be able to navigate the situation that a lot of people don't have.
To me, that's the true language.
Yes, 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 yes.
And I'll tell you, you know, when I was growing up in my family, they called me the bullshit caller. That was my nickname. And I think I still am the bullshit caller. I would do it in meetings at the community college, you know, when we'd all sit around and oh God, the stuff you debate and discuss in meetings. And I was always the one that would just say why we were really there. I can't stand, that's one of my biggest pet peeves, people who talk in circles without saying what they're trying to say.
Yes.
Even in minor examples, like I had to wait at the vet's office yesterday with my dogs, and I was talking to this lovely woman, and it turned out that our kids go to the same school. And she was like, oh, well, my daughter is just so overwhelmed this year. She's taking all AP classes, and she's just figured out that she can graduate a year early because she's so self-driven. She's taking all AP classes and blah, blah, blah. And I said, oh, so you're trying to tell me she's really smart? That's great. And I'm just so tired of people humble bragging that I just call it out. I call it out. I do it all the time.
And which seems to be relative because so many of us are done with anything that isn't real or true or genuine. There's just no room for it anymore.
No, that lack of authenticity I can't stand. And so that's why I call those subtle cues their own language. And I'm really good at reading between the lines and figuring out what people are really trying to say. Even in the South where I live, where Southerners, bless your heart, are really gifted at hiding what they're trying to say, you can read between the lines if you have empathy and that high EQ. And I'm telling you, it helps. It helps because then you can see truly what a person is and what their true motives and intents are.
And when you think about why people are let go from jobs, or why relationships end, or why there are conflicts in interpersonal situations, it is generally based on the emotional stuff. Can you handle the interpersonal problems? Can you read the cues? It's very rare that someone is let go based on, I really think there's more of an EQ quotient involved with our success levels, so I'm sure there are people listening who have very, very practical, linear, sequential, data-driven jobs that will say, no, if your columns don't add up, then you're going to be fired. But being able to say, my columns don't add up, but having those interpersonal skills to be able to say, what can I do to improve this, may shift the outcome of the situation.
Right. It may buy you an extra year. I think in the corporate world, it all comes down to numbers at the end of the day. And if you're bringing in the numbers, you're fine. And if you're not fine. But I do think that having those interpersonal skills can buy you time.
Yes.
For sure.
Yes.
But I do think that people that have the high EQ can make a difficult work environment much better just with their ability to help teams get along. What was interesting, you were mentioning Mr. Goleman, who started this research and wrote the book about it. He was saying one of the findings that they discovered with people who have high EQs is that they make excellent bosses and leaders and team players, which now we're talking about this, we understand why, but they prefer to work alone and tend to have their best success when they're able to work alone. And to me, that screamed EQ equals empathy, because that's one of the qualifiers of an empath. Empaths can work great in groups and teams, and they do make wonderful bosses and leaders, but empaths ultimately recharge, refuel, and reconnect to who they are by being alone.
Right. Very good point.
Yeah.
Very, very good
point. Empaths need to really embrace that and understand that. And I think in this FOMO society that we live in, that fear of missing out, we tend to force ourselves to do more and get out more and all of that, when really we need that opportunity to disconnect. And I think as parents, it's important, those of us listening who are parents, to recognize that in our children. When my kids were young, obviously I did nap time, but when they got into elementary school, I instituted quiet time. And they resisted and fought me on that. But the days that I would forget to do quiet time, because I'm not the most consistent parent all the time, one of my 3 kids would say, "Isn't it quiet time today?" And I
Oh,
knew that was their way of saying, okay, I'm going to fight you on this because I'm supposed to because I'm a kid, but I really need it. And so I did quiet time all the way up to middle school, and I still do it in the summer. I don't do it every day, but I'll have one day each week in the summer where I don't allow any of us to schedule anything. And we just have a day where we can, I don't care if they binge watch Modern Family on Netflix or if they just hang out at the pool or if they just read. I don't care what they do. It's just a day to just unplug. And I think as parents, we need to model that for our kids,
I agree. And
especially our
um,
empathic kids.
yes, and there are, a couple different ways to help build a child's emotional intelligence. And this is research by Dr. John Gottman, who has written some books on raising emotionally aware children, is, recognize negative emotions as an opportunity to connect. Because everyone's going to go through negative and positive emotions, and kids as well. And if they have a hard time controlling their emotions, stay compassionate, loving, and kind, and communicate empathy and understanding so that your child can start to piece that together and realize, if you say things like, it sounds like you're frustrated, I totally get it, or you seem really angry right now, you're giving them a skill set to be able to process the negative as well as the positive emotions that come along with being an empath or come along with being very emotionally sensitive. And by not punishing or dismissing or scolding, it's validating for them and it's not disregarding their feelings as insignificant, which goes into helping a child label their emotions. If they, and most preschools in the world, they'll have the big poster with all the different faces, and there's a happy, there's a sad, there's an angry, and to help little tiny people identify emotions. It's on tests to measure where kids are cognitively. Can they recognize emotions using phrases that validate. I can sense that you're upset, or it sounds like you're really hurt. It makes it okay to have those feelings and do set limits and problem solve. So I guess my way of saying that would be, don't let it spiral out of control so that someone is using it as an excuse rather than a way to but give them a skill. So yes, I understand that you're upset, but what could you do next time instead of hitting? It goes back to use your words.
Right. And I think if you didn't get that skill as a child, you can give that skill to yourself as an adult by giving each of your emotions equal time and attention. That's why I think studying Carl Jung's shadow work is so important, or Debbie Ford, who continued it. I think it's important because empaths so often were taught as children to stifle those emotions. My dad used to tell a story for years. He was a big war buff, and so I always wanted to be with him. So I'd watch all his war movies with him. And I don't know if it was The Bridge to Terabithia or whatever war movie it was, but there was some movie where a ton of men died and one dog died. And I didn't give apparently a crap about all these poor men dying on this film, but I cried for like 2 days over this dog that died.
Mm-hmm.
My dad would tell this story at dinner parties for years about how it troubled him that his daughter never cried over all these, heroes dying in this. It was a film. I didn't, I was like 5. I didn't know it was real, but I cried so much about this dog. And I remember feeling so bad about myself when he would tell that story. He never intended it. He thought it was just a funny story to explain, because we'd go to these dinner parties and I was always in and out of being a vegetarian, and because I loved animals so much, and my family would kind of make fun of me for that. And my dad would tell that story. Well, my daughter cares more about animals than humans. And I think it's important, if you had a similar upbringing where you were kind of belittled a little for being sensitive or feeling so much for animals or the underdog, I still believe you can nurture that little child within you today and not see it as a weakness or an oddity, but as something that makes you the high EQ functioning person you are.
Right. And don't you think a lot of the things we do to try to encourage our children to be more emotionally intelligent are things we can do for ourselves? Truly, just
Yes.
feeling the range of emotions, reflecting. I'm a big fan of the reflecting on your feelings and decisions. Like that's one of the reasons I journal every day is I might make a choice or have a confrontation or have a situation in my life or a high point, and I always journal about it to kind of nail it in with myself.
Hmm.
So,
I
you
think
know,
that,
and
and I like your choice of the word reflecting rather than judging or thinking.
right, because
That word.
don't you find that sometimes when we do reflect on an emotional situation, it's almost like, I never thought about it that way, or oh, that makes sense why I did this, and not in a too much in your head kind of way, but in a way to process it, which is what we would want to teach our kids to do, so that they would have
Yep.
more of a skill set.
Yeah.
Paying attention to other people's emotions, obviously we all do that as empaths. I was in a different social situation recently that was out of my comfort zone, but I think for kids and for ourselves as empaths, sometimes we do have to step over that line and go into a social or a situation that may not be our first choice, just so that we can either build more resilience or know we're going to be okay by taking a little step outside of that.
That's tricky. We got a question about that, Denise, on our Facebook page. Someone asked, as an empath, how do you know when it's like, how do you trust your fear in terms of stepping outside of your comfort zone? How do you know if it's just fear of stepping out of your comfort zone or your intuition telling you don't do this? That's a tricky question because that's hard. That's hard.
It is, especially if you have a physical reaction to fear-based of anxiety. If your heart races, you feel nervous, you feel fight or flight. I mean, if you're having the physical reaction, I think it makes it even harder to differentiate, is this a real fear or is this my own being afraid to step out of my comfort and move forward? There was
Mm-hmm.
a lady I spoke with recently, and she very connected with birds, and she said, when I want a yes, I asked Spirit a long time ago, show me a cardinal if this is a yes, show me a crow if it's a no. And she said every time she'll get those. And I thought, well, that's a pretty cool way. And she has a strong connection, very, very, very intuitive, sensitive person. So it can be that. It can be, for me, sometimes because I do tend to overthink the shit out of things, is I will take a step back and overthink it.
Me too.
I guess part of it is it a logical fear? Is it what's on the line? What are you risking? Are you risking that you might be vulnerable or hurt emotionally, or are you risking that you'll be homeless?
Right.
That's a wide spectrum, obviously, but
No,
sometimes.
but I think it's important when you're faced with something like that and you feel afraid and you're wondering, is this my intuition or is this a genuine fear? I think it's important to sit with that fear and ask it to tell you the answers. When your intuition talks to you, it's not really fearful.
No.
It's
No.
to me, my intuition is kind of emotionless. I know we're talking about emotion on this show, but when I get an intuitive message, it's consistent and it's not an alarm bell. When I get a
Right.
fearful message, the message is inconsistent and I get those alarm bells. The other thing that helps me is I'll flash forward to the result. So, for example, when I was first starting to think about leaving my beloved job teaching in a normal job situation and doing readings, I felt fearful. And I did not care if that was my intuition or my fear. All I could feel was the fear. But when I jumped forward and thought, what will my life be like if I don't break out of this comfort zone and try this? I felt such a sense of loss.
Right.
And I was more afraid of that than I was of breaking out of my comfort zone. Then I started getting all these opportunities to do what I now know is called platform mediumship, where you're on a stage. And I don't even mean opportunities like a stage like you might be thinking. I just mean like going in front of 15 or 20 people. That terrified. When I flash forward to not doing it, I felt really good. I felt like, yeah, that feels good. I don't ever want to do that. And then I knew that was not for me. And I think part of that has come with experience and learning to accept myself where I am. I am not a group person.
Right.
I'm just not that person. And I think because our society exalts the extrovert, for years I tried to be that person. I tried to be that extrovert. It's not who I am. And once
Right.
I started to embrace the introvert, it made it a lot easier to trust my intuition. So I think those would be my two answers. Sit with the fear and ask the fear to talk to you and see if the message the fear has is consistent or inconsistent. I know when I was thinking about doing readings full time, the fearful message changed all the time. You might not be good at this. You might fail. People will judge you. You'll lose friends. The message changed all the time. And that's how I knew it was fear and not intuition. Whereas when I thought about doing the stage mediumship, the message was always the same. You won't feel good up there. It's not who you are.
Right.
And that I knew was my intuition speaking to me.
But
And who
even
knows, that might change. But right now, that's how I feel about that fear.
but even before we met in New Jersey at that John Holland Janet Havoc workshop, I went and got hypnotized so that I could even physically stand up in front of people. So understand wholeheartedly what you're saying. And
Yeah.
that was a
Yeah.
very fearful out of the comfort zone. But for some reason, I knew I had to go. And obviously, we both know now why we had to go, but
Right.
it was bigger than both of us. But some people do gravitate to, and you put that very well, by the way, very articulate, very succinct. Thank you. The way
Thank
you worded
you.
it was beautiful. The You have to find your key with this, that if you are introverted, if you are more quiet, if you are more reflective, or you may be an incredible manager, and that's why people love you as the HR director, is because you're able to use your emotional intelligence to navigate all the different personalities. I think as empaths, it's a wide range that we can use this and involve it in
I
our
agree.
lives.
And it all comes back down, I think everything in life comes back down to loving yourself and accepting yourself. If you can love yourself and have compassion for yourself wherever you are on the journey, you will always be living from your authentic truth. And then you can share that with others.
Yes. So if we really wanted to throw one more little wing into this, it's, your IQ is about being learning. It's step by step. It's rule bound. It's very hardwired into your brain. Your EQ is more associative thinking, and it's more trial and error. It's based on experience. It's based on feelings and how you emotionally deal with things. But then there's also like a spiritual intelligence that gives us the meaning for all of it together. And it's what makes us human. It helps us to plan, to make sense of our emotions, to control our impulses, to make choices, and to bring meaning to what our world looks like. And that ties in, I think, with that frontal lobe of the brain where our ideas are creative, where plans are constructed. And bringing those three things together really feels like the balance of your purpose, your capability, and also your will, so that you can have a more balanced and successful experience while we're here.
Right. I agree. Said very well. Before we wrap up, Denise and I wanted to remind you all that we have a Mediumship 101 webinar starting September 20th. It's going to meet 4 Thursday evenings from 8 to 9:30 p.m. Eastern. It's a webinar. It's done over Zoom, so you can join us on the computer or on the phone. And we have a lot of emails coming in from people saying, I really want to take this webinar, but I don't even know if I'm a medium. And so I just want everyone to know that this class is designed for the brand new beginner. I think in all the webinars we've done, we've had one practicing psychic. The others have all been brand new. And what I find so comforting and exciting is at the end of the class, Denise sends everyone a survey so we can, just make sure we're doing our job up to your expectations. And the feedback we get always will say something along the lines of, I can't believe how many validations I got. I can't believe I actually did this. And that's why we do that webinar. So We're super excited. We get a lot of questions too, Denise. I've gotten a lot on my Instagram page. Will you teach this again? And we will teach this again, but probably not until after the holidays, because
Right.
this class will go into October, and then November and December, people are busy. They're not wanting to take mediumship classes.
Right.
They're trying to plan for the jolly man coming to town. So we will teach it again, but it probably won't be until 2019. So that class is starting September 20th. And then on September 19th, I'm teaching a 2-part crystal class webinar with Joel Hawkins. If you all haven't heard Joel, he's been on my other podcast a lot, Psychic Teachers. He is a certified crystallologist with Melody of the Love is in the Earth series. He has studied crystals for 2 decades and is incredibly gifted and well-informed in how crystals work and how you can incorporate them into your life. So we're going to be teaching a 2-part class webinar on that. That is Wednesday evening, September 19th and September 26th from 8 to 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And all of those links can be found on my website, SamanthaFaye.com. And we've also posted links on our Facebook page, Enlightened Empaths, and also on my Instagram page, Chakra Chick. And Denise, her website is thegratefulmessenger.com if you'd like to connect to Denise for readings or questions and information. Is that everything?
That's everything. I would just like to say a quick thank you, if I can. This is kind of out of protocol, but I was hosted in Toronto this past weekend by this amazing woman who opened her heart, set up a whole weekend for me to come up there and do readings. And I just want to express my gratitude. What a beautiful, beautiful blessing to work with so many like-minded people and to step out of my comfort zone by, leaving New England to go do readings, but also just to realize that we're all in this together. It was just fantastic, and I wanted to publicly thank this lady for an absolutely brilliant and amazing weekend.
Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I didn't know if you were comfortable mentioning that. We were talking about coming out of the comfort zone. I wanted so badly to prod you. Because that's scary. I mean, Denise had a woman who loved her readings so much. She bought a bunch of gift certificates, and those went really, really well. And then she said, you know what, I just want you to come here for the whole weekend. And so this woman flew Denise out to spend an entire weekend giving readings to this woman's friends. And that, to me, that's daunting. If someone's flying you out, putting you up in a beautiful hotel, just so you can give her friends readings, the weight of that expectation would have sat heavy on my heart. And you did it, and you did it well. And I hate to say I'm proud of you, because that's so condescending. But
I'm proud of me too.
I really am. You should be.
But it was just to be in a different, and if anyone needs to go to a beautiful city, Toronto it's clean, it's beautiful, it's just lovely, lovely, lovely. And I went to some amazing restaurants and saw some cultural things. So again, thank you very much for that opportunity.
Oh, that's so great. I can't wait to hear more about it. And maybe you'll share more of it with our listeners too.
Yes.
All right. Well, we will be back with you again next week. We've got some really exciting and interesting guests coming up in the next couple of weeks, so we hope you keep tuning in. If you like us, please take a moment to tell a friend or leave us a review on iTunes so we can keep building our community of like-minded, spiritually awakened people. Don't forget to always show up, do great work, and share your light. Have a great week, everyone.
Bye-bye.